Have you ever realized that you spent your entire life believing something that was true only to find out that it's not? I know I have. For example, when I was a kid, I was fascinated by the idea that humans only use 10% of our brains. I would proudly tell people that I was working to make sure I was using at least 50% of mine. It turns out I was right, just not the way I thought, because that whole statement is definitely not true. We use 100% of our brains pretty much all the time, even when we're sleeping. Another very common belief you hear all the time is that when people eat sugar, they get hyper, especially kids. But it's just not true. And here's the funny thing, people will argue with you about this even if you show them the scientific evidence. They'll point out times that they've seen kids eating a bunch of candy and drinking a bunch of sugary soda and then going absolutely bananas. This is one of those situations where correlation is not causation, because when you start to ask questions, you'll find out that they observe these moments in situations like birthday parties or on Halloween or at school when the kids have been forced to sit quietly all day. It turns out that hyperactivity is often just plain old excitement. And you would actually get the same reaction if you actually gave the kids bananas instead of candy. Well, there are so many other things like this that just aren't true, like that coffee stunts your growth, or that Albert Einstein failed math classes as a kid, or that it takes 7 years for chewing gum to pass through your digestive system, or that ostriches stick their heads in the sand when they're scared. If you thought any of those were true, don't feel bad. You were using 100% of your brain. You just fell victim to a common problem we all have. You see, our brains really like to hold on to information that's novel or unusual to us. It's probably an evolutionary mechanism to help us survive, but it also means when we're hearing something new, especially if it's peculiar or interesting, we tend to hold on to that information and we have a hard time letting it go, especially when we hear it from other people or see it reinforced in media. So when you're in a college classroom and you hear a statement like, "The sociologist Robert K. Merton was the father of the focus group," you tend to believe it, because for decades it was a claim you would find printed in many books, articles, and reference guides. And it makes sense, right? Because Merton was one of the most influential and celebrated sociologists of the 20th century. But recently, there's been a movement to credit the real inventor of the focus group method. And it might not surprise you to know that this person not only knew Robert Merton socially, but was also at one point married to Merton's research partner, Paul Lazarsfeld. And if you're guessing that I'm talking about yet another woman whose contributions to science were ignored for decades while a man took complete credit, yeah, that's exactly where we're heading. We're going to talk about Dr. Herta Herzog, an amazing academic who is the actual creator of the focus group method. I'm Sean in St. Louis, and this is the Marketing Gateway. Before I begin talking about Dr. Herta Herzog, I want to mention that the last decade has seen a lot of attention being paid to just how much women contributed to the arts and sciences in the 20th century. Margot Lee Shetterly's book, Hidden Figures, The American Dream and the Untold Story of the Black Women Who Helped Win the Space Race, helped to energize this momentum in 2016. But there are also books like Radium Girls and Code Girls and The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks and Rise of the Rocket Girls and The Queens of Animation that talk about all sorts of other situations where women were working behind the scenes while men took credit. So when I first shared the story of Herta Herzog with my qualitative research graduate class, before I even got past the words, "Did you know a woman was actually responsible for creating the focus group?" one of my female students rolled her eyes and said, "And of course a man took credit for it," because she knew, as many women do, that this is such a sad and common occurrence that it's not even a surprise anymore. We all just kind of expect it. But you know what? We can at least undo some of the wrongs of the past by giving credit where it's due. And so let's talk about Dr. Herta Herzog, an Austrian sociologist who not only was one of the founders of what we today call insights research, my profession, but was also the person who outlived all the other people credited for it. And that's pretty impressive, considering she was also a polio survivor. Herta Herzog started her academic career in Vienna, where she received her PhD studying under many prominent academics, including Paul Lazarsfeld, who supervised her thesis. Their relationship turned romantic, and Lazarsfeld divorced his first wife, the influential social psychologist Marie Jahoda, and Herzog followed him to the United States, where they got married once his divorce was finalized. And I do want to be careful here not to define Herta Herzog by that marriage, which lasted about 10 years, because it's actually just a small part of her life story. But it is an important part because Paul Lazarsfeld was a hugely influential figure in sociology in America. And he also began working with Robert K. Merton in 1941. And Herta Herzog definitely knew Merton, though as time went on, he was less and less likely to actually mention that fact. So the story, and it might be more appropriate to call it a myth at this point, is that Lazarsfeld and Merton met more or less for the first time at a dinner party at Lazarsfeld apartment and began talking about their work. Lazarsfeld started explaining his process called the Stanton-Lazarsfeld Program Analyzer, a tool used in the Rockefeller Foundation's radio research project. It was a method for evaluating how radio audiences felt about programming at moments during the show by using a method similar to dial testing to measure positive or negative sentiment. But the problem was that getting audiences to explain why they felt this way in a manner that was actually sound was pretty difficult. So Lazarsfeld was also a big believer in empiricism, and he didn't want to introduce a qualitative element that wasn't valid or reliable for the purposes of research. Merton shared this desire and had an idea for adding in group interviews that asked questions in a careful, precise way to get the groups of people to explain their feelings. As the story goes, the two men got so excited about all this, they headed off to the radio studio, leaving their wives, Suzanne Carhart and Herta Herzog, at the apartment with an uneaten dinner. Merton and Lazarsfeld collaboration led to a 1948 paper called Mass Communication, Popular Taste and Organized Social Action that became a foundation for media studies. And the focused interview technique they developed became commonly used in applied research, eventually taking on the name focus group. And it became very popular with advertising agencies, tobacco companies, and political consultants. Merton definitely took credit for the invention of the method, though he did grow to dislike its use since focus groups tended to be conducted in a non-rigorous, non-scientific manner that didn't suit his academic principles. He was also quoted at one point saying that he wished he'd at least get a royalty whenever the method was used. But Merton didn't always take credit for the invention of the focused interview. In fact, his earliest publications detailing the method acknowledged Dr. Herta Herzog as being the first scholar to use the focused interview. And indeed she had, as far back as at least a decade before Merton began taking credit. Her method was known as gratification research, but it was based on a method of qualitative interviewing that had been developed in Vienna that drew from the psychoanalytic method, opening lines of questioning up to a discussion format where the role of the interviewer was simply to get a participant to open up and speak freely. This format was quite different from the more interrogative style often used in social science, where participants were restricted to short answers and the interviewer, not the participant, would presume to know what they were thinking through predetermined lines of questioning. And what did she use this research method for? Surprisingly, soap opera studies. Her most famous paper, What Do We Really Know About Daytime Serial Listeners?, involved talking to housewives about their motivations for listening to radio soap operas. She also worked on the research team that studied the impact of Orson Welles' 1938 broadcast, The War of the Worlds. But what Herta Herzog is best known for is actually not her academic work. She left academia in 1943 and joined the brand new market research department at the advertising agency McCann Erickson, the first agency to hire psychological research staff. Herta Herzog's influence was so well known along Madison Avenue that she became known as the founding mother of communication studies. And as Robert Merton gradually erased her role in the creation of the focus group by giving her less and less credit until he eventually gave her none at all, she continued to be a pioneer of integrating qualitative research into serious marketing research studies. Now you might wonder, did Herta Herzog view herself as the creator of the focus group? So as it happens, just a few months before she died at the age of 99, she gave an interview to Gerhard Kleining to discuss her life. And when the topic of focus groups came up, here is what she said. "That is my invention. I did not invent very much, but the focus group for sure. At the age of 99, this is no longer of importance, but if I am proud of something, then it is the focus group." Now, in a strange twist of irony, or perhaps not, Robert K. Merton later was credited with coining a term called the Matthew effect that describes exactly what happened to Dr. Herta Herzog. The idea of the Matthew effect is that well-known scientists often receive more credit for research than those who aren't as well-known, even if they produce the same quality of research. It's a reference to the passage in the biblical book of Matthew in which Jesus says, "For to everyone, one who has will more be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away." And of course, there's a lot of empirical evidence to support the existence of the Matthew effect. But did Merton come up with this idea on his own? No, of course he didn't. He later admitted he co-created the idea with sociologist Harriet Ann Zuckerman, who would later become Merton's second wife about 10 years before he died. Now, Zuckerman had noticed women scientists tended to be systematically disadvantaged in pretty much every way and began collecting the data to prove it. And you want to know something even wilder? The Matthew effect is just a more famous name for a far earlier idea now called the Matilda effect, which was, of course, published by a woman, the suffragette and abolitionist Matilda Joslyn Gage, back in 1870. It really makes me wonder if we ought to take a closer look at some of Robert K. Merton's other accomplishments, because behind this so-called father of the focus group and modern sociology, there seems to be quite a few women whose work he took credit for. But in the meantime, we can be grateful to Dr. Herta Herzog for pioneering one of the foundational methods of marketing research. And if you'd like to read more about her, I've included some good references in the show notes. I'm Sean in St. Louis, and this has been The Marketing Gateway. See you next time. Today's plug is for giving credit where it's due. And this is something I have always worked hard to do in my own career, because no matter what I have accomplished, it's always been with the help and support of someone else. Like on this podcast, for example. I have 2 team members helping me out. Trish helps me with scheduling, and Holly helps out with production. You'll get to hear more from them in upcoming episodes. Both are also part of my research agency and play important roles in our studies as well. There's also the research I do for this show. I try to cite sources for anything that's not general knowledge, but unless I have a good reference handy for a particular topic, I almost always start with looking things up on Wikipedia and then reading the primary sources linked from the Wikipedia page. Somebody had to spend time adding all that information in those sources, often uncredited in what they contributed and in their free time. And thank goodness they did, because it makes my job easier. And then, of course, there's my support structure, which includes my wife, my parents, my brothers, my still living grandmother, and my kids, as well as other friends and family and colleagues and clients who help make everything I do possible. I'm also really appreciative to the marketing community we have here in St. Louis and the marketing mentors who've been willing to be a part of this show. And, of course, anyone listening now, you're part of this too. And thank you so much for listening. I could go on. There are so many people I can thank for anything I do in life. But here's the wonderful thing about sharing that credit with them. My accomplishments stop being about me, and they start being about us. I wouldn't have it any other way.